In our last lesson, we talked at great length how the British East India Company's policies were affecting the ruling class of the Indian subcontinent. Now, in this lesson, we will be focusing on how those company policies were also affecting different sections of the society. That is to say, we will again try to trace the various causes of the revolt of 1857. So let us now begin this discussion on the causes that contributed to the revolt of 1857. Having talked about the Rajas and the Nawabs in the last lesson, let us now find out about the diverse sections of the society and how those were affected by the company's policies. British economic policies left peasants, artisans, small zamindars grappling with poverty. Now the peasants are the ones who are always the worst hit, be that of any calamity or even in the society, because these are poor people, and these poor people in the Indian subcontinent hailed from the rural regions. These people were already very poor. Added to that, various new taxes were imposed on them. It was becoming increasingly difficult for these peasants to pay those heavy taxes. The East India Company sought to maximize its revenue that could be earned from the Indian subcontinent, but the peasants were very badly suffering because of this. At the same time, the artisans were also suffering because of these East India Company policies. The artisans lost their autonomy and independence. They were no longer able to do the works that they have been doing generationally. Instead, they now lost their jobs. And unemployment also gave rise to hunger and poverty among these people. And at the same time, the small zamindars were also very badly hit by the British economic policies, because these economic policies were not at all meant to take care of the interest of these people of the Indian subcontinent. Instead, the economic policies were meant to benefit and add to the advantages and resources of the East India Company's government. So as a result of this, all these sections of the society were reduced to poverty. They were grappling with poverty and hunger. And how long can a person stay hungry but content? That's not possible. When one is grappling with hunger, with poverty, that person will be pushed to the edge. And likewise, these various sections of the Indian society who were affected by the policies of the British East India government were also pushed to the edge. So it was inevitable that they rose and broke out in rebellion against the company. So from the movie clip which saw just now, we can understand how the peasants were brutally and miserably treated by the company officials. The peasants really had no say in this. They were the poorer ones, and they were suffering because of the company's policies and rules and reforms. The peasants had to pay huge amounts of taxes to the British under their new revenue policies. This is a point that we have been harping upon all along. The East India Company wanted to maximize its revenue. It wanted to extort everything that the people of the Indian subcontinent had, which is why it implemented many revenue policies. Revenue policies in the likes of permanent settlement, Royatwari settlement, or even Mahalwari settlement imposed very heavy taxes on the peasants. Now it became increasingly difficult for the peasants to pay the taxes. As a result of this, anger and hatred were burning in the minds of these peasants who were suffering under the company's rule in the Indian subcontinent. But do you think the peasants had an option of not paying the taxes to the East India Company? Most definitely not. The ways of extorting taxes from the peasants were also very strict. Now these peasants were the ones who were not able to pay taxes simply because it was impossible for them. How could these poor people pay such high taxes? they often failed to do so. And when the peasants failed to pay the taxes, they were evicted from the lands. That is to say, they were no longer allowed to enter the lands where they have been working for many years. Now, this was a very negative thing to be done to the peasants. These people were poor. They earned their bread by working on these lands, and when they failed to pay those arbitrary taxes which were imposed by the British East India Company, they were evicted from the lands. During this period, eviction became a very regular thing. Many peasants and small farmers were evicted from the lands. In fact, many landowners were also losing their rights over the lands simply because they were not able to pay the revenue that was meant to be extorted for them. And at the same time, many landowners were also losing their lands simply because they were not able to pay the taxes and the revenue that was supposed to be paid to the British East India Company. So all these reasons, as you can understand, are points of culmination. These are points that will eventually lead to the Great Revolt of 1857. Now, the British East India Company wanted to drain the resources that the Indian subcontinent had. The Indian subcontinent boasts of different kinds of resources, be that in the form of spices or other grains. Now, the Britishers did not want to grow many food crops here in the subcontinent. Instead, what did they want? They wanted the production of more and more cash crops. Cash crops in the likes of cotton, jute, or even indigo. Now, when the farmers were compelled to grow more and more cash crops, they were not able to grow food grains for themselves. And you'll be surprised to know that the indigo farmers were often beaten and brutally tortured if they produced any kind of food grain apart from the cash crop of indigo. Now, these things were actually helping the British economy because the British economy was flourishing at this point of time. And raw materials and resources like cotton, jute, or even indigo were required by the markets in England. And so the British East India Company officials made sure that these cash crops are grown in very high numbers in the subcontinent so that they can export all these raw materials. Now, what do you think was the repercussion of this? Because of the reduced production of food grains along with the export of raw materials, now took place very severe famines because the masses were no longer able to feed themselves simply because the peasants were not able and allowed to produce food grains. They had to produce only those cash crops which were required by the British market. And as a result of this, it were the Indian masses who were suffering severely during the famines. So the situation was very dire in the subcontinent, and needless to mention, you can understand very well why the masses were seething with anger. Tension was rife in the subcontinent between the Indian masses on the one hand and the British East India Company on the other hand. As students of history, we should not look just on one side of the coin because both the sides of the coin would give us a holistic picture of something. And we should keep this in mind when we talk about the East India Company in the Indian subcontinent. While the British East India Company was very oppressive and torturing, it imposed very brutal and strict rule in the Indian subcontinent. It did certain good things as well. So let us now focus on those good things that were introduced by the British East India Company and how those were also seen in a negative light by the Indian masses. Now, the British attempts to bring about social reforms was seen as an interference in religious matters by the people of India. Now, to understand what is being said here, let us now take into account certain practices which have been prevalent in the Indian subcontinent since ages. These practices are very oppressive in nature. These practices like sati or even female infanticide are very oppressive in nature. Sati refers to the burning of the widow on the funeral pyre of the husband, and female infanticide means the killing of a female embryo. Now these are very oppressive practices which have been prevalent in the Indian subcontinent since ages. But when the Britishers came to the Indian subcontinent, they wanted to bring about social reforms. That is to say, they wanted to stop these oppressive practices. They also wanted to introduce widow remarriage, because earlier on widows were reduced to a state of nothing. After a woman lost her husband, the widows were compelled to live very miserable lives in the Indian subcontinent, which is why through many social reforms, the Britishers wanted to change this system and introduce widow remarriage. Now these social reforms were further given impetus by various Indian social reformers like Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Jyotirao Phule. Now these people were trying to fight against the social evils that had been prevalent and existent in the Indian society since many ages. Now these people were trying to fight against the social evils that were there in the Indian society since many centuries. Now when these people were trying to bring about these social reforms, this was also seen in a negative light. Now I am sure you must be questioning why this was so. Because these people were actually wanting to change the oppressive social practices, the oppressive social order. So why was this not seen in a positive light by all the people? This is because many of these practices, however oppressive those were seen as religious matters. And various conservative sections of the society now believed that the Britishers were interfering in the religious matters, which is why they were not very happy with the social reforms that were being brought about around this period of time. They saw the East India Company's rule as foreign. They saw it as an alien rule that was trying to hurt their religious sentiments, which is why these social reform works were seen as a negative interference by the conservative sections of the Indian societies. The East India Company did not just want to gain power over the lands of the Indian subcontinent. Instead, they wanted to bring all the people under their control. How could they do so? For this, they wanted to convert the Indian masses to Christianity. And to this end, the Charter Act of 1813 now granted permission to the missionaries to come to India and undertake religious conversion activities. Now, missionaries have been coming to the Indian subcontinent ever since the beginning of the East India Company's rule in the Indian subcontinent. But now, it was this Charter Act of 1813 that made this process much easier for the missionaries to come to the subcontinent and convert the masses to Christianity. Now this was also seen as an attack by the Indian masses. This is because they were saying that their traditional religions, their social systems, their systems of order were being replaced and supplanted by the British ways of living, by the Britishers' religion, which was Christianity. After the year 1830, Christians were allowed to own land and property. And in the year 1850, conversion by Christian missionaries was made easier by passing a new law. Now, around this time, missionary activities gained impetus in the Indian subcontinent. This is because more and more missionaries were coming to several parts of the Indian subcontinent, and all they wanted to do was to spread their religion, that is Christianity, among the masses in the subcontinent. And after 1830, Christians were also allowed to own land and property. So, the people who converted to Christianity, that is to say, those Indian masses who now converted to Christianity, were allowed to inherit their lands. And if they did not do so, many a times they lost their control and authority over the lands they possessed. And at the same time, in 1850, a new law now made it much easier for the Christian missionaries to come to the subcontinent and carry out various missionary activities. Now let me give you an example in this regard so that you can understand what is being said here. Suppose I have gone somewhere and I am trying to control the people living in that region. I am considering those people speak a language which is different from the one I speak. So what will I try to do? I will try to promote my language among them so that they get to speak my language, so that it becomes easier for me to rule them. Now the East India Company had a very similar intention and motive when they came to the Indian subcontinent and assumed power over the lands and the people. They wanted to spread their language among the masses, because if the masses spoke a different language, it became increasingly difficult for them to rule those masses. So what did they do? The East India Company now promoted English education. And so with the promotion of English education, more and more Indian masses were now being trained in English. And these people were now being able to speak the language of the East India Company officials, which is why interaction and communication between the masses and the company officials became easier. So this is the reason why English education was actively promoted. And at the same time, the official language of India was changed from Persian to English. Now Persian has been in wide use in the Indian subcontinent since the rule of the Muslim rulers in the Indian subcontinent. But now it was with the East India Company's rule that Persian was now giving way to English as the official language of the subcontinent. Now the masses also saw this as an attack on their social order, because they have been using this Persian as their language, as their official language for many years, and now suddenly it was being replaced by a language of a foreign power. Though English education was promoted among the Indian masses, not many knew this language. So suddenly an alien and unfamiliar language became the official language of the subcontinent. This is another reason why the masses were angry against the colonial rule. Now before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Which language replaced Persian as the official language of India during the rule of the East India Company? Was it English, Sanskrit, Hindi or Arabic? Well, the correct answer is English. English was the language of the Britishers who had come to rule the Indian subcontinent. And when they assumed power over the land, they changed the official language of the subcontinent from Persian to English. Now the Charter Act also did another very important thing to the company officials. That was to assert a fund of 1 lakh to be spent on the spread of Western education in India. Now Western education was also a very strategic tool that was used by the company officials, because with the promotion of English language and English education, they wanted to spread Western education among the Indian masses. Now they saw the Indian masses as backward, as ignorant, which is why they wanted to bring them enlightenment through Western education as they believed. And so the Charter Act of 1813 asserted a fund of rupees 1 lakh for the spread of Western education in India. So from this we can understand how the existing social order was slowly in the process of giving way to something new. And needless to mention, this was severely resented by the Indian masses. Along with this, lands were also made available to Europeans who were willing to build schools in the subcontinent. Why was this done? The main motive behind this was the spread of Western education in the subcontinent. And where do you think did the East India Company get more and more lands to give to these Europeans who were wanting to build schools in the subcontinent? Well, as we discussed a while ago that when the peasants were unable to pay the taxes, they were evicted from their lands. These lands were occupied by the East India Company and it used these lands to its own advantage. And in this regard, these lands were given to the Europeans who were wanting to build schools in the Indian subcontinent to spread Western education among the masses. So this brings us to an end of our discussion on some of the causes that led to the revolt of 1857. We learned how diverse sections of the society were affected by the company's policies and reforms and various kinds of rules. We also learnt how the existing social order, be that in the form of religion or language, were being changed and replaced by new social orders when the East India Company was ruling the Indian subcontinent. And all these reasons were actually contributing to anger in the minds of the people. All they needed was a spark, a final ignition to break out in rebellion. In our subsequent lesson, we will be tracing some of the final reasons that eventually led to the Great Revolt of 1857. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.